I would just like to confirm that we've got Team Ireland present and we've got Team Sri Lanka present, correct? It would appear so. Can you just... Okay, I've got that information here. So I'm going to just introduce the panel of judges. My name is Paida Mangondo. I am the chair for this round, and I'm an IA, but I'm based in Sweden and used to live in South Africa. So then we'll go through the different judges, allowing them to introduce themselves. Or should I just introduce all of you, and that'll make life easier?
Go for it, Paida.
Okay, so we've got Yoni Cohen-Idov, who's just spoken. We've got Luka Petrovic. We've got Akira Kato. We've got Katja Broomberg. We've got Delaney Hurley, and we've got Cindy Zhao. Then for the teams, I'm going to call on each speaker. Before we do that, team in opposition, Sri Lanka, is it possible for you to put down your full names in the chat?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to go through the speakers, and as I do so, I guess this is not necessary because both teams are in the same room, or both teams have all of their speakers in the same room. But on proposition, we've got Jack speaking first. Okay, Jack Mulvihill speaking first, yeah. Jack Palmer speaking second, and Matt Mallon speaking third, with Jack Mulvihill speaking reply, correct? And then in opposition, we have first Janu De Silva. Then in second, we have Chanudu Ratnayake. And in third, we've got Shalem Sumathiran. Oh, great. And thumbs up for pronunciation, apparently. Thank you. And in reply, we've got Chanidu Ratnayake. Okay, perfect. Before we begin, can the teams clarify how they want POIs delivered, be it visually or orally?
We're good with verbal.
Okay, so both teams would like verbal POIs, so that's how we will proceed. In terms of timing, I will make use of Debate Keeper, so you'll hear a bell. Hopefully you can hear it. Oh, wait. Can we hear this bell by any chance? Yes. And if I remember, please forgive me if I don't, I will try also use hand gestures for timing to aid the speakers in case we don't hear the bells as well, to the best of my abilities. Great stuff. So I think that deals with most of the formalities. And can we please have the first speaker from the proposition, Jack, open the debate for us here.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen. For too long, private individuals have donated to charities that spend more money on advertising than they do on actually achieving their goal, because that is what is necessary to be a successful charity in the status quo. That is the comparative in this debate. What does our policy look like? A few things. Firstly, you will give money to a central fund. That is to say, you donate money to a central fund where that money is held by the government in the majority of instances. More on that later. Secondly, an independent body similar to that of a central bank or the judiciary will determine which charities are the most effective. That looks like doing that on proportionality, not on absolute numbers. Meaning if you're a cystic fibrosis charity, you can be just as effective as a cancer charity, even if it affects less people. The way we would do this is by measuring the majority of qualities, i.e. the quality of adjusted life years that a charity is able to achieve. But then when it comes to the distribution of that money, it will no longer be an issue of that independent body. It will then be an issue of public discussion. That is to say that part of the reason you now elect a representative is because they care about a certain charity. Within Parliament, we'll discuss, based on the list that is published by the independent institution, which charities will receive the most money. And what that does is, it means we don't donate all of the money to one charity. We don't donate all of the money necessarily to the most effective charity, but that money is distributed effectively in a meaningful way based on what the public wants this to do. Thirdly, then, note, the motion says a large proportion. That means there is a minority proportion of money that does not go into the central fund. The minority portion that doesn't go into the central fund on our side of the house is the minority of charities that deal with people who have ascriptive characteristics. That is to say, if you are a gay charity, a charity to do with ethnicity, or a charity to do with race, you can still donate that money to them directly. That is the minority. We are fine to do that. Then, panel, who wins this debate? Although we think funding and the majority amount of is an important issue in this debate, really the team that wins is the team that allows you to maintain a large majority of your funding, is more democratic, and crucially, just uses that funding most effectively. So, panel, the comparative in this debate then becomes between the status quo and the system that I've just outlined. That's how this debate is going to happen. Panel, I'm about to bring you a principled point as my first point as why it's unjustifiable for private individuals to give donations. Note, this is in no way contradictory to the minority funding that we just talked about, private individuals being able to donate to ascriptive minority causes. Because these people in the minority, in the ascriptive minority, have traditionally and oftentimes still are locked out of the democratic system. They are unable to express their democratic will the way that those in the majority are, because it's more difficult for them to vote, because they're in a position of poverty. And for that reason, this is in no way contradictory to our principle. But crucially, these charities are a tiny minority, so they don't really need to contend with our principal claim. To understand this principle, you need to understand who makes charitable donations. The people who make charitable donations in the developed world, 90% of charitable donations are made by the top 1%. In the developing world, 90% of charitable donations are made by the top 0.1%. That looks like philanthropists. It looks like CEOs. It looks like people who are extremely wealthy. Why is that the case? Because they have the actual capital to do so. But secondly, they have the moral incentives to donate because of the fact they've benefited so much from society. Now, Palmer, I want you to understand the nature of altruism. What I just said. In an acknowledge of your privilege, the reason you are altruistic, you are lucky. You know, people lost out for you to be in that position. You know that you won the birth lottery. You know, and it makes you, even if you don't believe that, even if you think you're the most successful individual in the world on your own merits, it makes you feel happy when you donate money, which is why the majority of money is donated by these people. Why is it then not sufficient to increase taxes on these people to allow them to take that money off those individuals? Firstly, it is way harder to do because politically it is a lot less viable, a lot less attractive to increase taxes than it is to increase charity funding. But secondly, charities have expertise when it comes to very specific issues that the state just doesn't have. Why do we think then that the distribution of charity funding should be done on a democratic basis? Firstly, these people who donate the majority of money benefit from the workers who work for them, right? They represent the citizens within that country, the citizens that live in that country, the people who donate money to charity benefit directly off that work. You work in that factory for that CEO, you're benefiting them. Then that person in return has a right to in some way have their interests heard rather than it just being the interests of that CEO. But secondly, wealth is entirely arbitrary, right? Regardless of what that CEO thinks, their family might have benefited from the slave trade. Their family might have been born even smarter. Like these are the kind of things we're talking about. The idea of wealth being something that you accumulate based on your ability to work hard is a tiny percentage of the reason that people accumulate wealth. It's because their family was wealthy, because their family discovered oil, because they were born extremely smart, right? These are arbitrary things, and I don't think that they are reasons that someone should be able to donate money to charity and another person then should not be able to have their interests heard. We've proven to you then should be democratically, that principally charity donations should be democratic. Why then are we more democratic? Because you as an individual now have representation, right? Because representation in the majority of instances is equal, whereas capital is not. Sure, it might not be entirely representative, but the majority of people have a vote. The majority of people don't have enough capital to make meaningful charitable donations. Therefore, it gets more democratic on our side. What I'm going to prove to you, secondly, is that charities are more effective at spending money on our side of the house.
On your side of the house, would you make volunteer workers for less effective charities go to the more effective charities and work there under your system?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The volunteer workers in less effective charities, would you make them go work for the more effective charities according to your system?
No, we don't think we would. We think that, sure, there might be layoffs within that charity because they have been less effective, and therefore, as a result, those people get laid off because they have less funding. They can go work for those charities, but I don't think the efficacy of a charity is what we're really talking about when we're talking about employment. Okay, secondly, then, why are we more effective at spending money? Firstly, why is the state going to be effective at distributing these things? Firstly, I think it's because the state will be actively punished if they don't do it effectively, right? In the majority of states, you know where this money is going. In the majority of states, you know which charities are effective and not effective as a voter, which means you can vote out a government that doesn't do it effectively. But secondly, in less accountable societies, which are traditionally poorer societies, the government relies more and more and more on charitable donations, which means if you're the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and you find out that that government is not distributing your money effectively, you can just pull out, right? So these states have an active incentive to distribute money effectively. Why then do we think that people still donate on our side, meaning we still have the majority of donations on our side of the house? Because the reasons for donating money still exist, right? Philanthropists and wealthy people still have the image incentive and the incentive of making themselves feel good for donating money. But secondly, it's just easier for the majority of people to donate money now because they don't risk not knowing where that money is going. Sure, they don't know what charity that money is going to, but at least they know it isn't going to a charity that is going to spend more money on advertising or is going to be a corrupt charity in the long run. Why then, given this, are we more effective at using that money? Firstly, you can no longer operate off a brand, you have to operate off competition. That is to say that as an enfranchised charity, you don't need to rely on being effective to achieve donations because people are so incentivized, so used to donating to the Cancer Society that you don't even need to be an effective charity to actually receive donations. But secondly, it's really difficult to regulate charities on their side of the house because if a politician stands up and says the Cancer Society isn't using their money effectively, that's an extremely bad image. At least on our side of the house, we have the soft power of deciding who gets donations to determine which charities are effective and give donations on our side of the house. But thirdly, you just spend less money on advertising. You spend less money on marketing because the reasons that you get charitable donations is entirely based off merits. Look, panel, I think it's regrettable that we have to talk about this motion, but until charities are brought into a system where their efficacy is determined on their efficacy and not their ability to have pretty billboards, I think this is the solution we need to have.
Okay, great. Can I just confirm, judges, are you ready?
Time.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Excellent. So then I thank that speaker for their remarks, and now I call on the first opposition speaker to begin their case.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Panel, a few years ago, my grandfather died of cancer. And every year since then, my family has made a small donation to the National Cancer Foundation. Now, that donation might not be a lot of money. That donation might not save everybody. It probably won't help find a cure in the near future. But even then, I think it's incredibly demeaning of side government to say that the donation isn't important. To say that just because we're not part of the 1%, that it can just be taken away by the state Because ultimately, panel, it's important because even if you can marginally reduce the suffering of people, we think that agency holds water. They have not responded to that principle. Before I move into my argumentation, a few points of framing. First, what do these charities look like? Notice they exist on a vast spectrum of aims, things like environment, helping people with disabilities and diseases. But notice the blatant squirrel they make in their case when they exclude characteristics that are ascripted. Panel, that is literally the vast majority of charities. Charities that help women to gain inclusion into the workplace. Charities that help individuals that are African American. Charities that help individuals who are African American and trans. All of these, panel, exist on a spectrum that is based on ascriptive characteristics. But even if you're going to talk about individuals in the poor, that is an ascriptive characteristic too. You do not control where you happen to be born. In all these instances, panel, they just shot away the majority burden. They literally don't know what they're talking about. But even in that instance, let's take this further. But the second point of framing is where this money comes from. Because their characterization, that is the 0.1% that makes all donations, is a blatant lie, panel. The vast majority of charitable donations is made up from the people in the moderate and the people in the rich. That is to say, individuals in the middle class, the lower and upper, constitute a significant portion in the fact that they put $5, $10, and that adds up. The fact that you can run literal campaigns built up from the $2 that individuals chip in because they think a cause is important, totals, they don't respond to that at all. But third, the basic premise that charities are ineffective, we think, is untrue. That is to say, what we can support in terms of a stance is increased transparency, the state ensuring anti-corruption laws within this. I think the broad majority of argumentation that you cannot control charities is simply non-comparative. It exists on both worlds. But I think the crucial mistake they make is when they mix up the Marxist brief with the debate brief that they were supposed to for Prop 1 speech. Because basically everything you spoke about you having a claim to that property, just includes very few individuals at the very top of the spectrum. But even then, panel, the solution they give, that you need a democratic basis, is again not the motion. Because the motion says you rank them based on effectivity. It isn't that you let the people vote. You probably have a central figure. Again, they don't seem to be sure what they talk about. But let's take them at the absolute best here. And here I'm going to integrate my responses. Here, let's take them at the absolute best and say that a democratic system works. Even in the instance, it's inherently majoritarian. So individuals that have privilege and power are the ones whose goodwill you are going to be reliant on in propositions world to get the charitable funding for individuals in the poor. I think that is, again, the exact same system that they go against. Final point of response in terms of basically everything they support is exact same thing as tax. And the only refutation they give to this is, oh, look, taxing people is hard. Panel, that is not a response. They need to tell us why they simply cannot extend that same principle. And they're not really forcing people to give to charities. I'm not sure what they're doing at all. But finally, why are charities effective in our? That is because people can just simply take away money from charities. If they don't see changes happening on the ground, they rightly take back that funding, and no amount of advertising is going to cover up if people are still starving, if people are still poor. On the comparative endeavor, to vote the state out, you not only need the majority support, but it also takes 4 years in terms of election cycles. I think it's vastly more comparative in our. I'm going to hear two arguments in this speech. They're going to prove our two burdens, that one, state reclamation of donations is unjust. Second, that it's counterproductive to charity work. I'm going to give two arguments. The first, why states do not have a legitimate claim to this money. But second, how you get less donations. Chandy will give you a third argument on abuse. Before I move on, sure.
So you say that you stand over individual donations. Would you stand over taxpayers deciding where that tax money goes? So I won't fund the health system, but I'll fund the army. You have to do that if you stand for your principle. I hope you know that.
No, because tax is something that everyone gives to the government on a premise that you consume government resources that gives the government a claim to that. That doesn't exist to resources that weren't taxed. That's the point. First argument then, why states do not have a claim. Notice, panel, that states fulfill obligation through tax. So your obligation to the poor is fulfilled by giving resources, by giving housing, and that works. There's an extension, and if we prove that this overreach, then that is unjust. First, there's a particular sanctity to your labor. That is to say, it's built up on the premise that you own yourself, that you mixed your labor with unclaimed land, or you used your entrepreneurship and expended resources. And in that instance, you have a legitimate claim to the proceeds of that because you are the person who was responsible. The state was built up on that premise that you protect that individual right. In that instance, it becomes a private transaction. That is to say, it was acquired through just means, that you obeyed the laws of the land, but also that you paid a legitimate amount of tax. Because notice, they're going to quibble about people not paying tax. That's simply non-comparative. That is a systemic flaw, but not a flaw with the principle itself. In that instance, the state cannot encroach into private transactions. So the state cannot say you shouldn't invest in a company that is ineffective, because that is a personal choice that, given the fact that you voted the state in, the state recognizes that you as an individual have the agency to do. But second, there are specific reasons why people donate to charities that are important. That is to say, the intent that stems from your agency could either be from like personal experience, where Marcus Rashford, as a football player in the Premier League, wants to give money to give like school children lunch just because that was something he benefited of as a kid. It could look like people in relationships with you suffering from a certain disease and you wanting to put money because you want to help people in those same circumstances. It could look like the local chapter of your charity because you just want to see your community prosper as well. But notice in their world, you might end up funding charities that are oppositional to your beliefs. So as a woman who gets an abortion, who puts money into charity, that could end up funding like the Catholic Church that you might not want to do. In all these instances, they rob people of the basic agency to control money that they had a legitimate claim over that they made justly. But third, notice the inherent subjectivity. And the metric they talk about is like, people voting. Hannah, that's ridiculous. In that instance, the progress of a charity is incredibly hard to measure, given that there is a distinction between like long-termist and short-termist policies. That is to say, things like lobbying in terms of the BLM might not manifest like immediate returns. Things like research by the Cancer Foundation, like they say, would probably give you like a full-out zero on like effectivity. But in the instance where you do make a breakthrough, the dividends are massive. In their world, they don't take that into account. But second, you do not get a clear delineation among charities. That is to say, in their word, you cannot say like whether the BLM or like Black rights as a cause is more or less important than cancer because they don't exist on the same plane. In that instance, states do not have their claim. It reverts back to the people to choose of their own accord. Second argument then as to how they get less donations. And notice, in any instance, charities are beholden to the goodwill of donors. That is, people on the street choosing to put their money into charities. If that goes away, charities fall. The first reason is you get less donations. That is because the reason you give money is based on the methodology, on the cause itself, on what you believe in terms of a principle. So the instance where the state steps in, where you don't know where it's going, with a cause you might not support, you're inclined to take that back. And notice the critical contradiction they make in their case when they say they wouldn't force people to work for like more effective charities. In that instance, given that it's your own labor, the fact that you volunteer of your own, or the state cannot step in the instance where the state does, you probably wouldn't do that. But the second reason is you get less money. Because in the instance where you feel like the state is intruding, you're not going to give that same amount of support. So even if in their world charities are more effective and have marginally more money, that is incomparable to the amount of money you lose by people not donating at all. But finally, you lose out on fledgling charities. Charities that lack the economies of scale to come out as effective. Charities that cater to intersectional causes like Black trans rights. In these instances, they're not going to be seen as effective because they cater to a small portion of people. Their returns are low. In those instances, they get shut out and they can't just model that out with a squirrel. In all these fronts, panel, we're taking this debate.
Okay, so can I just confirm that the judges are ready? And yeah, perfect, excellent. So thank you very much to that speaker for that fine speech. We now call on the second proposition speaker here.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
All POIs the same. Chairperson, honourable educators, ladies and gentlemen, if this proposition wants to make a debate about who gets more funding, but that funding all goes to waste, they've already lost. If they want to make this about where I should be able to spend my arbitrary gotten wealth, they lose this debate. Three things in this speech. Firstly, going over the debate so far. Secondly, weighing that debate up. And thirdly, bringing in our third substantive on small charities. So, the 6 things here in the debate so far. Firstly, on the characterization of who is donating. We say it is very, very, very enfranchised, very well-off people for 5 main reasons. Firstly, because they're people who have non-essential capital. They don't have extraneous costs which would come beforehand. Secondly, you would say they have no personal needs at all. And even if it's a personal small need, such as I may need a bigger fridge, yes, we think it's regrettable that people think this way, but it's far more tangible to conceptualize your own small need than someone else's absolute need, which you can't relate to. You don't know what it's like to have. If you can't relate to that, something you can, even if it's less important, you're probably going to prioritize. Thirdly, there's a conception of burden. If you're not someone who's rich in society and you think that these people need to be helped, you probably turn and think, that's on the enfranchised, that's not my burden, it's someone else's. And fourthly, there's this idea, a lot of donations done, and this idea of optics to promote your brand as a whole or your image simply doesn't apply to unknown average people where that doesn't affect them. Fifthly, then, a lot of donations comes to get tax credits, and this simply is only enfranchised people who have the time to process that, or an accountant who can suggest to do that and process it for them. But sixthly, we would say anyway, even if they say that is the middle class, sure, if all that analysis applies to the middle class equally true, that is good. The crucial thing is it's not working class. It is not people who generate wealth in society. And it's people who have gotten wealth arbitrarily, whether they be slightly rich or extremely rich. Secondly, then, on the definition, which they tried to swirling a little bit. Three things to say here. Firstly, we say it's a perfectly reasonable debate. We've set up a principled debate and a beliefs motion about who should decide where charitable donations go. Secondly, we would say this is of all donations, not of donations. It is very much, the motion itself is designed to suggest that you take all ideas of where all donations go, you take a part of those causes and separate them out separate to the pool that you would have. And thirdly, we would say, specifically didn't say women, because in a lot of instances, they are enfranchised democratically in society. It is about in instances where you're not enfranchised in society, which also crucially means you're probably not getting most of the donations towards your causes either. If you're not in a society where you have your rights respected, you're not in a society where you are respected. This is about small disenfranchised groups. Anyone can get cancer, not everyone is LGBTQ. Thirdly, then, on this idea of like the POI they sort of asked, and they sort of brought it back up, like forcing workers to work in effective causes. Firstly, we would say here, this is not in violation of our principle at all, because where you choose to work is not an arbitrary place. Firstly, because the pay is about the same and equal in different charities. And secondly, because they often rely on retirees who don't rely on pay. But thirdly, even if we ignore that, and sure, if it is true, if it does fit into principle, we would say sure, but we might still not do it just because it's extremely difficult to legislate. You don't have a central body that just decides where funding goes. Fourthly, then, on taxes, how this is an issue in the debate. Because firstly, we would point out how it said this is different because you simply have less political capital if you want to do this all through taxing instead of doing it through a system of donations. Secondly, we would say it's just efficacy. It makes sense to do it through existing structures. And also we would note how this clashes with their principle, because it is the same as tax. They say you benefit from everything in the state, but we say that is the collectivization of wealth. So certain people, say if you get sick in a public health system, benefit from that. That is the exact same process as charities, where you have collectivization of wealth, and certain people benefit from that. Particularly then separately on their principle, they say, firstly, it stands because of agency. We say that is equally true of taxes. The more you pay taxes, the less personal agency you have. So they do have to stand over that. Secondly, we say this idea of personal reasons. We have two responses, like you fund what you want. You have two responses to this. First of all, you choose that as an enfranchised person. You don't choose it as someone who may be more affected by different issues in society, or the true issues in society. It's not legitimate for you to make that call. It's not your wealth to do it with. Secondly, we would say someone else will fund your cause. Even if you're funding something which goes against your beliefs, someone else is funding what your beliefs are for. Sixthly, then, on efficacy, we say this is not long-term, short-term. It is about effective spending. So the debate so far, we think that this is about affecting the vast majority of nations as set up in the characterization. And also, even if the pool shrinks, which we don't think it will, as I'll touch on, you have more outcomes for the people in need, and this is an absolute principle. I'll take a POI before I move on.
If rich people already attempt to pay less tax, what incentive do they have to give money to the government to distribute to charities?
Because that is one of the ways they pay less tax. I brought this up when I talked about tax credits. It's one of the ways they do it. And also they may just want to have different optics, have that good image. We've already discussed this. Right, so then in our third substantive, that we make small charities significantly more effective. Why is this particularly important, first of all? Three things. First of all, because they often fill in niches in societies, unknown issues which aren't catered to by larger societies. Secondly, we say these are small but crucial things. They are things be aware of, but can have devastating causes if they're not supported. And this also means they don't get many donations in status quo. Thirdly, we would say they would advocate for these unknown issues. They spread awareness of them. How then do we change this for the better? Well, because when you're competing on efficacy, not brand, this is actually, not only are they no longer disadvantaged, it's also an advantage for these companies. Because firstly, they tend to be extremely efficient. They don't get much funding, they have to use it effectively if they want to survive at all. And secondly, because they're extremely motivated. If you're applying for such a niche, if you're being such a niche charity, you're probably extremely motivated for that. You probably have personal reasons why you are, you care about it, you're going to use that money more effectively. Note here that this means they're likely to score very high when these charities are ranked on efficacy and thus get more funding now. Secondly, we would say they can't compete in status quo because it's all about marketing, which requires huge funding, especially when you care about these crucial issues. You simply not only can never compete in marketing because you have way less money, but all the money you do have needs to go elsewhere as soon as possible. This means that there is no alternative in status quo on Sri Lanka's side of the house for how these small charities can get bigger, can get the funding they finally need, which doesn't happen in status quo. Thirdly, we would say the public discussion would be extremely beneficial because, as we said, they're probably going to have impressive rankings. That's extremely salient. It shows this is a really effective charity, which is really effective at creating this new issue. But it also means they get that exposure. When you're seeing that it's published in the New York Times that X charity, which is previously unheard of, is really effective, that causes exposure for the issue. This means these small niche issues are finally talked about in public discussion. This also secondly means that there's an increased awareness about more and more issues in society. It's not just about cancer and AIDS anymore. It's about AIDS, Addison's, cancer, crabs, cystic fibrosis, neglected tropical diseases, and so on. The crucial aspect of this is that it means more people are aware of more problems in society. More people are likely to get more donations. This clashes with their second substantive because they're aware of more issues. There's more things to fix in society. There's more for you to fix as a person who isn't franchised, who has wealth. You're going to donate more. You want to make the world a better place. Prop never gets this, never been happier to, Op never gets this, never been happier to propose.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yes, you can. Let me just quickly do a check with the judges. Judges, are we ready? Yeah, I've got the thumbs up, excellent. So thank you to that speaker for their fine remarks. We now call on the second opposition speaker here.
Well, I'm going to be very candid. I'm extremely confused because in their first speech, they try and tell you that their model is one of distributing this charity and deciding effectivity based on public opinion. And that was the basis of their principle, that charitable donation should be more democratic. But they instantly double down on that in Prop second speech when they say, oh, no, this isn't about public opinion. This is about the effective allocation of money. And that's why startup charities, for example, will still be significantly more effective than branded charities. I'm not entirely sure what effectivity means to side opposition, but to us, it means work that you're able to put in that has a tangible benefit to the people that you want to help. This can't be decided by public opinion. This can't be decided by elected
officials. It likely is decided by the same independent bodies that they wanted to support in part of their model, but didn't want ultimately deciding where the vast majority of this money goes. I think this is a significant squirrel that they've done of this motion, but I think second squirrel that they did with this motion was to exempt charities based on the fact that they represent social movements. Because it was their second speaker, and check your flow, he actually said this, that this debate is not just about some money, it's about all tax or all donations or all charities particularly. I think it's unfair for them to exclude a certain kind of charity which they can't defend by fiat. They do not have the ability to do that. There are three questions in this debate. Firstly, on what exactly, on like a clarification on model and whether these smaller charities are exempt. Secondly, on whether this is principally justified. Thirdly, on whether this is effective for charities and charitable causes. Firstly, then, on clarifications on model. I've already made one thing clear. Effectivity does not equal public opinion. That is an unfair squirrel of this debate. But the second thing they tell you is that, it's very easy to measure effectivity because it's based on the quality of those charities. So if as a cancer research institution, you increase the quality of years of life, for example, that would obviously be a tangible impact. Now, Jamal already told you as to how this prioritizes long-termist or other short-termist charities that are able to say, we gave homes to 100 people, for example, as opposed to the Cancer Research Institute that represents people who are just as vulnerable, who is putting in just as much work, but can only say that they've achieved something once they get to that critical breakthrough in research. They are unable to point out as to how they've tangibly helped individuals until that point in time. The tie-up of this is very simple. To the point at which these kinds of values are subjective and arbitrary, to the point at which you can't pin down and compare different categories of charities, the next best stakeholder to make this decision is people. This is why you already allow individuals to make private transactions, for example. They need to deal with the fact that they haven't defined what effectivity looks like. But finally, on how minority charities would be exempt. I've already told you that this motion is about all charitable donations. But the fact of the matter is, one, these are the vast majority of charities. So if they do that, they're not fulfilling their majority burden. But secondly, the fact of the matter is that almost all charities represent vulnerable people who are locked out of the democratic process. This is literally why the government is not helping them and charities need to step in their place. So homeless individuals, for example, would still be locked out of the democratic process, even though it's not based on an ascriptive characteristic. I think their own principal justification of what kind of charities that they would exempts the majority burden. The second question in this debate then, as to whether this is principally justified. But before that, I'll take a point.
If, as you say, people should decide where donations go to, why do only rich and enfranchised people get to decide and not all the people?
We already told you that the vast majority of donations come from individuals who have small amounts of disposable income. If you look at the rise of things like donations in terms of charity and advertisements, that already happens. But secondly, I would argue that on your side of the house, what you're still getting these individuals or these individuals who are rich, for example, to give the vast majority of their money to charity. I'm not entirely sure how this changes the distribution of wealth in society generally. On to the principle then. The first thing that they wanted to tell you, and this was a mischaracterization that I just clarified, that the vast majority of donations come from the 0.1% of the richest people. That's factually incorrect. If you look at solving nutritional insecurity in the US, for example, that came from the vast majority of individuals who had small amounts of disposable income. Look at like Bernie Sanders' campaign, for example, that wasn't funded by millionaires, that was funded by people who each gave small amounts of their own disposable income. Their own argument about how charities focus so much on advertisements is a concession to the fact that they want to appeal to a broad range of individuals. But secondly, and this is important because this is the actual comparative material that they give you. We can't tax rich people, so let's just move the money around that they give to charities. Jamal already told you, this is absolutely not a reason not to tax the rich. If Jeff Bezos can have millions and millions of dollars that are tax exempt because he's able to cheat the system, we should not concede to those kinds of individuals. We should seek to actively tax them more. But secondly, the distinction between taxing these individuals more and changing their charitable donations on their side of the house is entirely arbitrary because this money ultimately all flows to the government. If Jeff Bezos doesn't like to give money to the government to be redistributed into public goods, why would he want to give money in the form of charity to the government to again be distributed to other public goods in the form of charities? I think the same incentive that the rich individual has not to pay taxes exists not to move money of charity. But the point is, panel, to the amount of wealth that he has is extremely small. It's probably less than 0.1% of overall how much he's making. Just moving this small amount of money around does nothing to help the poor workers who are literally dying in Amazon warehouses, for example. But additionally, what they do is create complacency among governments, because they are now able to point to the fact that they're donating this money to charities, that this is going to individuals who need it the most. I think on their side of the house, Amazon workers still die in their houses. They don't solve their problem. But the final quip that they get here, and this is very peripheral, is that all wealth is arbitrary. The point is, panel, they still support a system of private property because they still support a system of donations, which is what they want in the first place. So I think even if in some instances historical injustices exist, they still support the overall system that exists on their side of the house. What they're making here is an argument for Marxism, and that's clearly not what they support. There's a distinction between what they're trying to do here. But fine. The concession that they made on our POI about volunteers, because they conceded to the fact that there is a sanctity associated with your labor. The government simply can't control where you put this money. This is the exact same reason you can't control people's money. Because even if it is as an enfranchised individual that you decide to put this money into a cancer research institute, you're still able to use that money to buy goods, for example. Do they still support a system of private property? I'm really confused. The third argument then is to how you create a greater scope for state abuse. Firstly, I think there's a perverse incentive on their side of the reveal corruption. This is because once you take money away from angry donors who would have wanted to see that money go to their charity of choice, you as a government are now beholden to these individuals to put it in the most effective charities. This means that even if in hindsight it is revealed that the fact that this charity was actually corrupt, the charity that you were giving money to, I think governments have a perverse incentive not to reveal these kinds of corruption because it means that they get voted out in the next election cycle. But secondly, I think it hinders social movements because people who donate to Black Lives Matter, for example, donate as a form of protest against a corrupt government that is killing Black people. If that money goes to the state, why would they ever want to donate in the first place? The point is, panel, no matter how racist or how authoritarian your government is, under our system, people know that the $10 that they donate to their local charity will stay that same $10 regardless how governments change and shift. I think the fact that they make donations more democratic is actually dangerous for the most vulnerable, those individuals who now have to rely on the goodwill of governments that are by nature majoritarian. For all of these reasons, side with side opposition.
Okay, thank you very much to that speaker for their fine remarks. Judges, are we ready? Okay, great. So now I call on the third proposition speaker. Here.
Can I be heard, Chairman?
Yes.
Sorry. Anyway. Okay, so I'm good to go. Perfect. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, you have not heard one mention from our two speakers of the word squirrel, of cheating, of trying to sling mud. In a debate about charity, Team Sri Lanka have been extremely uncharitable to our case. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the principled clash. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about efficacy. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about small charities. Before I get into that, right, let's have some clarifications over the kind of half-definitional challenge we've gotten from the first 2 speakers. If they didn't like our definition, they should have came out in the first speech and just challenged it, rather than just trying to sling mud and ruin the debate. 3 clarifications. Firstly, they say we can't have a mode of public discussion because it is purely based off of efficacy. No, panel, it would be impossible and insane just to donate all of the funds to the most efficient charity. There has to be some sort of selection process based off of those rankings. Whether that is an individual on a board, that is their own personal opinion. Whether that is the public, that is a series of opinions. So what this means, right, is we do mark them off of efficiency, but there will always have to be an opportunity cost where we select one charity over another, and that's the point at which we have public opinion involved. There's a clear comparative, right? On their side of the house, you have private individuals. On ours, you have a system by which they're ranked based on efficacy and a mode of public discussion. There's a fair comparative. They should have engaged with it. But secondly, right, they also accuse us of squirreling by saying we'd exclude, the charities that we're talking about. Note the panel, the motion literally says a large proportion of charitable donations. A proportion implies a fraction. So there are some donations we are leaving out of this model and out of the system. We make it very clear that this makes sense to have it be the charities that don't have that kind of democratic accountability due to historical disenfranchisement, or they don't have the critical mass. They say that applies to every charity. No, it doesn't. Everyone can get cancer. Not everyone can be black. Not everyone can be gay. Right. To charities that make up the vast majority of charitable donations apply to anyone. They say homelessness, I can be homeless tomorrow. I can't suddenly become black or gay if I'm not already one of those characteristics. Okay, the debate is now clear now. I hope it's a bit less messy than it was at the conclusion of that speech. Let's go on to the first clash about principle. They say this is Marxism, and they're not principally consistent because they don't acknowledge that private property shouldn't exist. Note this just isn't the realms of the debate, right? If they claim that there's symmetric analysis about it being principally justified to have a system of Marxism, sure, have that in another debate, but maybe it'll be the final. But right now we're talking about charitable donations. We're being principally consistent in terms of our remit as a proposition. But what they don't respond to, right, is they just counter-assert that these charitable donations come from ordinary people. 5 reasons we gave in our second speech that never went responded to.
Yeah, right.
Tell you that rich people have more non-essential capital. Secondly, we tell you that they have less personal needs. Thirdly, we tell you that they have more of a conception of their burden to society than an average person. Fourthly, we tell you that they have an optics incentive due to their privileged position in society to give as much as possible to charitable donations unless you get calls for eating the rich, which we see on social media all the time. That's why people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates give huge amounts of money to charity due to public unrest and issues of perception. Fifthly, we tell you about tax credits, which doesn't really go responded to. Their only response was Bernie Sanders' campaign came from ordinary middle-class people. Are middle-class people ordinary, panel? Note that middle-class people benefit from the same types of structural inequality that we tell you about that Bill Gates benefits from. They inherited their house. They got up into a private school. They had more time with their parents at home because they weren't multiple jobs. Just to say, what about middle class people? Sure, the analysis is symmetric. Those people make up a tiny fraction of the population on the planet, right? They are the 1%. The 1% of the United States is a joint household income of $150,000. That doesn't sound like a lot of money if you're a middle class person, but it absolutely is a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. We are being principally consistent when we include those people. And since they said, oh, it's middle class people, panel, realistically, if you're working 2 jobs, you do not have the money to fund a charitable donation. You're spending that on your kids. You're spending that on immediate necessities. We tell you a number of reasons why this is democratically consistent, but let's engage with them on their principled grounds, right, about sanctity of labor and all of that. Firstly, when it comes to sanctity of labor, they acknowledge when they concede that they wouldn't give people the chance to choose where their tax money goes to, like I'll fund the hospital, but I won't fund the army. At the point at which they acknowledge this, right, and they just say, oh, that's different because it's the state. No, it's not. The state is just a subset of society's resources. If you encompass all of society in the structure that we're talking about, the point at which, right, that they say you should be able to choose that, but you can't choose taxes, they're not standing for a principled ground that is consistent. But right. Second, when we talk about limiting your agency and the sanctity of your labor, why wouldn't we move people? It's because there's a difference between my bodily autonomy and literally what I'm working for and an extension of that being my financial capital. The vast majority of people don't have savings. They don't have capital. They spend their money on the needs that they need to have to survive. We're fine with people working where they want to work. But the point at which you have savings, you have investments, you have capital that is being spent misappropriately, we're fine with redistributing that in a way that's holistic. Yeah. We tell you that never gets responded from in either of their 2 speeches. Firstly, we tell you have representation at the point at which you are able to democratically mandate that public goods go somewhere. We tell you at the point at which it's arbitrary, and they acknowledge this, and those people have profited off of the exploitation of people's labor. They have historically profited off of the exploitation of people. If they inherited that wealth, if they're descendants of colonialists, if they're descendants of slave money, they owe a duty to society who's disenfranchised. They have representation as form of their altruism. We're fine with taxing the rich, right? This is another bit of mudslinging. We're fine with taxing the rich. But the point at which, right, there is money that is not going in taxes on either side of the house. We simply want that money to be spent in the way that I am describing. At the end of this, right, we are clearly more principally consistent. But let's weigh this up. At the end of the day, I'm fine with someone having less sanctity of labor if they're a middle-class person, or even if they're a working-class person, because the amount of people we're talking about, right, who have been disenfranchised and have absolutely no say of where that money goes for is simply much greater, and it'll be a greater moral duty to those people than the types of people that they're talking about, right? So we are more principally consistent. But let's talk about efficacy. They gives us something about corruption in their third point I'm going to respond to right now. Firstly, we tell you that it's a huge point of public scrutiny, the point at which these lists of efficacy are likely to be published in national media. It would be a huge social taboo for a politician to act inconsistently in line with those records. They would be instantly ousted from office. That is information you can easily have access to. But secondly, right, let's take them at their very best, and we're talking about kleptocratic societies, we're talking about dictators, we're talking about rampant corruption. We tell you that those are the societies that are most dependent on financial donations to cement their power. And the reason for that, right, is if I'm Robert Mugabe, I am fine with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funding malaria nets because it keeps people happy and it's money that isn't leaving my pocket. I'm never going to want those people and make them leave my society and not fund that. But we give you a number of reasons as to why we are more likely to be efficacious on our side of the house. Their only response is, you're not going to donate anymore. Look, the rich people analysis, if you buy the rich people characterization, obviously there's interest that you have the heart to donate because it improves your public image and you have capital to spend. But even for ordinary people, the people that I talk about, like my mother had cancer, or my grandfather had cancer, like the example we heard there. You're obviously a good-natured person who cares about charity. I don't think you're going to be spiteful and just withdraw those funds if you're a person who's been impacted by societal harms in the way that you're describing. But at our worst, we're fine with those people because people who've actually been directly impacted by these charities are in the extreme minority of instances in which these donations take place. We give you a number of reasons as to why charities are going to be more efficient. Firstly, we tell you that when you incentivize more efficient spending, where I don't pay my CEO a bonus, where I literally can't spend that amount of money on marketing because it will ruin my efficiency score and I won't get as much funding in the next round of funding in the government budget, that is a huge incentive for charities to spend their money more equitably. No panel with their principle, right? They're more principally consistent if they're on our side of the house because their thing is about autonomy and your money going where it needs to be. The point at which that money is misappropriated and spent uncharitably by those charities, that's the point at which that principle falls on our side of the house if you want to buy their principle clash. But note, right, at the point at which we have charities spending money on marketing, spending money on salaries, that comes at a huge opportunity cost that is not just morally egregious, but is also hugely harmful to the vulnerable people that we talk about. Not only are we more principally consistent panel, not only do we actually follow the rules of the debate and not try to make it messy, we're also more efficient. Never been happier to propose.
Okay, thank you to that speaker for their fine remarks. Judges, are we ready? Great, I've got some thumbs up. Yes, okay, excellent. So then I now call on the third opposition speaker to continue the case for the opposition. Here.
Can I be heard if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Panel, I'm going to blame the proposition for a messy debate in the semifinals of the WSDC because the setup of this motion is about all donations to all charities redistributed across charities on the basis of the effectiveness of that charity. I'm going to explain why proposition have not been debating on the spirit of this motion, why that's created a really just a weird debate, but even taking them at their absolute best, why they still lose this debate. Why is it that we didn't definition challenge them, but rather that they're not debating in the spirit of this debate? Two reasons. The first is when they exclude charities that operate on the basis of ascriptive characteristics. In that instance, we pointed to you the fact that a large majority of the problems that exist in the world right now are because of ascriptive characteristics. This looks like women, this looks like minorities, this looks like different religions, this looks like homelessness, this looks like poverty in very many parts of the world. These are all ascriptive characteristics. They did not deny this. In that instance, when they say that they are going to remove those particular charities from this motion, they are then taking out just a large proportion, not a minority, but a large proportion of this debate simply out of this debate. We don't think that's in the spirit of the motion. But secondly, look at the grammar in the topic, right? It says all donations to charities. This means that it is 100% of the donations, a proportion of that 100% would be taken away. That means that this motion has to apply to every single charity. They're not fulfilling that burden. The second squirrel that they make, why it's not in the spirit of this motion, is when they're on their model of public opinion. And here in the second and third speech which they try to make this strange conflation between public opinion and effectivity. They don't give us exactly a metric as to how they're going to conflate the two, or how it's going to be like a mix and match. And I don't really see how exactly they're going to quantify effectivity along with public opinion. What if public opinion is that all money should go to the cancer research facility, but none should go to the homeless? How is that like, I don't see how the principle is being satisfied in any way in those instances. Why is it the niche markets on their side of the house are suddenly going to get more attention? Because apparently public opinion is going to be centered on those niche markets. I just don't understand it. But just secondly, recognize that that's the same as status quo, right? The problems of inefficient allocation of resources happens, right? So wait, let me make this clear. People donate to charities based on what they think you should donate your charity to. If that is the same opinion that's going to be reflected in Parliament by virtue of your representatives, I don't know what proposition is changing in this debate. The fact that they are just like doing the exact same thing as status quo points to the fact that they recognize that it is impossible for them to defend this motion or their model, and therefore they just decided not to. We don't think that's the debate in this round. Before I move on, I'll take a PI just for clarification purposes.
You say that these people are just going to tell their representatives what they choose on. But the difference is, it's not just some people deciding, it is all people deciding. You need to contend with this full principle and actually take it on its ground.
So your logic is that all people don't get to decide where the donations go to now, but apparently all people get to decide where the donations go to once it is given to the state. I don't see like the point of this, because if I give my donation, I should get to decide where that donation goes to. If that's the principle that you're saying, the fact that like the 0.1% of the most rich people in society give their donations, apparently 100% of people in the entire world should decide where that particular donation goes to. But that's not like a fulfillment of your principle. If I'm giving the donation, I should get to decide where that goes to. That's more satisfied on our side of the house. But I'm going to take them at their best anyway. First clash. What is the principle in this debate, and why is it that we win it? Here they tell us that their principle is that of democracy, right? That you should be more representative, that there are certain instances where wealth was accumulated unjustly. But the fact is that can be redressed through tax. And that is why tax exists in the first place. I don't see a difference in the motion that proposition bring forward and simply increasing taxation on the most rich people in society. If the only difference, according to their characterization, is that the most rich people get their money moved around, then we would do that in several other ways as well, without putting the onus on charities, which will exist for several different reasons, as opposed to just giving the benefit, the welfare to the all society on their side of the house. So in that instance, we can get that same fulfillment of democracy or representation on our side without having to go through this motion. I don't see why it's necessary. Secondly, they say that most of the wealth comes from 0.1% of people. This is fundamentally false. Sure, they gave you a lot of reasons why rich people do donate, and we concede that rich people do donate in some instances, but that does not count for the fact that there are hundreds and millions of other people who also donate. So them just giving you incentives as to why rich people do donate does not take away the incentives of other people in the same vein. Why is it that other people have an incentive to donate? The fact that A, they think that it's a good cause. Second, the fact that they are personally affected by the cause. And thirdly, that they have disposable income that they can give. The middle class is the majority of society panel. So sure, even in the poorest of countries, I can still afford to give $5 or $10 to a charity because I think I want to feel better about myself and I want to feel like I'm doing some good for the world. So on their side of the house, we do have like a lot of other individuals who give money as well. But secondly, the richest of society don't give a lot of their money to causes that they want to support through charities because they can do it through other means, through direct investment, through lobbying. The vast majority of charities that we're talking about in the status quo are like religious charities, right? It's like small-scale charities, niche charities that operate in certain, like for example, in like very small areas in developing countries. Those are not the charities that the richest people give to. That is the minority of the case. But thirdly, recognize that they don't deal with the comparative on our side of the house. And here's where we mentioned Marxism, right? Because if they want to say that all wealth is gotten arbitrarily, then they need to support taxation of individuals, not the willing donations of these individuals that are somehow moved around. Because that does not fulfill their principle that the wealth that they got arbitrarily should be taken away from them and given to other people. Because that is on a prerequisite that money is given willingly by those very same individuals. By comparison, on our side of the house, we said that the vast majority of people who give their money, give it because they earn that money, because of the fact that often they work themselves up, because of the fact that they did a job, and because of the fact that they're given for personal reasons. They concede this principle when they say that you as a worker can choose to work wherever you want to. In that instance, we think it's unfair that your money is taken away and given some arbitrary thing. We don't think that they contested the actual principle, rather they chose to strawman it. Second clash then, on who better distributes money. First, they tell you that states are accountable, right? That the fact that you're going to be voted out instantly, apparently, as soon as you do something bad. We don't see why the same logic can't apply to charities. The fact that a charity is ineffective probably means that a person is not going to donate to charity anymore, and they're going to donate to like another charity. That is the instant way which you hold them accountable. So what's the comparative here? It is that states are far harder to hold accountable because elections are often in 4 or 6 years, that it is very much dependent on multiple people voting out the same government, despite the fact that they have several other policies. So it's worth time, like it depends on time, as well as the fact that it's very indirect, as opposed to charities, where it is a very direct form of accountability, where you just stop giving them money and give it to somebody else. On a comparison basis, we have more accountability, therefore money is likely to be spent better on our side of the house. But secondly, they don't respond to the actual argument Chanidu gave you. Instead, again, they choose to strawman it. That is that there is a perverse incentive of governments to not reveal the corruption of charities because they're directly affiliated with those charities now, and they don't want to be voted out in the next election. The fact is, not all governments are dictatorship or Denmark. That are government, no, you're out of time. They are governments that exist in the middle of that spectrum. So in that instance, you're going to have some form of perverse incentive being acted upon. On our side of the house, anti-corruption laws, transparency is more likely to happen because governments are not affiliated with the charity. But secondly, they are going to have less donations. Well, here is why. If the most rich in society give money to charity willingly, they're not going to do that anymore because they don't want that money going to the government and being redistributed according to a public opinion where everybody gets to decide. Rich people give their money for a specific cause. They're not going to get that cause fulfilled. You're not going to get the money. Therefore, the vast majority of money on their side is just never going to reach them. But secondly, ordinary people are not going to give anymore because they don't know where that money is going, as conceded by their first speaker. So if I don't know where my money is going, the thought that somebody else is probably going to donate in that same vein as well is unlikely to convince me to give my $10 to charity as well. In that instance, we've dealt with like all the material. You're not going to have efficacy on their side of the house. You're not going to have niche charities having like more attention on their side of the house because it's based on public opinion. But ultimately, proposition have not debated in the spirit of this motion, which is that's fundamentally a reverse of what this round should have been, and therefore side with the opposition.
Okay, thank you very much to that speaker. Judges, are we ready? Yes, some nodding, some thumbs up. Excellent, thank you. We now call on the opposition reply speaker to close off the case for the opposition. Here.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Just checking.
Yeah.
Cool. Panel, just for my own sanity, I'm going to try and be as charitable to proposition as possible and deal with the comparative parts of this debate, which is very little of their case, all of our case, and talk to you about how we still win the debate, even if you magnify what little material that they had that was actually relevant to this debate. So I won't spend too much time talking about the definition and the squirrel, but I'm just going to highlight very quickly as to what those two things were, just so you don't forget. One, they unfairly excluded charities that were based on ascriptive characteristics. This is against the wording of the motion, which is about all charities and all donations, not a proportion of charities that are exempt from this and the vast majority of charities, which apparently are where you have all of the money taken away from those charities. But the fact is, this doesn't fulfill the majority burden either. This debate should ideally be about charities that represent people who are the most vulnerable. Charities, by nature, often represent vulnerable individuals who are locked out of the democratic process. Therefore, by their own principal justification, they should have to defend the vast majority of charities that are based on ascriptive characteristics, from which on their side of the house, they would be taking money away based on the idea of effectivity. But secondly, on their model. To a point, they support effectivity. But once it starts to hurt their case, they fall back on the idea of public opinion. Because apparently, you can effectively allocate and create like a registry of charities, but you wouldn't want to give each of those charities like an equal amount of income, which is ideally what donating or distributing on the basis of effectivity looks like. Rather, when there is some squibble about whether this charity that is ranked second or this charity that is ranked third should get what amount of money, they revert back to public opinion, the same kind of public opinion that has all the same problems of like relying on brand image that they talked about. This debate wasn't in view of the spirit of the motion. But nevertheless, there were two questions. Firstly, on principle. I just think this was like an overbroad principle that they ran from first speech onwards, right? If all money is acquired unjustly and through the enfranchisement of the rich, that doesn't change on their side of the house. All they're doing is moving around money that already exists in the system to different kinds of charities. If they actually supported this principle, they would support our counter solution of increasing taxation. I don't know why they ran this as a principle. But the point is, if in fact that is the case, that even some middle class individuals do donate to charity, then it is unfair if even some of that wealth has been acquired justly to then redistribute it on the basis that, oh, you simply stole this wealth from the poor. Therefore, all of the analysis we gave about how the reasons for giving to charity were extremely personal and were reflective of your own personal values still stand in this debate and still deserve to be acknowledged by states. But secondly, on the pragmatic clash, and this is where it got the messiest. Firstly, they tried to just point like a completely random solution, which is that the rich aren't being taxed enough, and prove as to how they solve this issue. One, they don't actually solve the issue because the rich aren't paying any more in taxation or any more in charity. If anything, they pay less in charity right now for the same reasons that they pay less in taxes. But what were the actual comparative parts that we gave you in this debate that brings us? One, we talked about how you create complacency among states, about how it's harder to tax the rich on their side of the house when they're seen as giving back to society in an effective way and giving directly to governments. Secondly, we talked to you about long-term charities, about how they're disproportionately disfavored by this notion that chooses to prioritize charities that actually have tangible gains. Thirdly, we talked to you about how political capital gets worse. Literally, panel, the only thing that is protecting individuals who are part of social movements who rely on charity, for example, is the fact that it doesn't matter who's in government. It doesn't matter how short-termist the government is that wants to get re-elected. Your donation remains the same regardless of those perverse incentives born of political capital. But finally, the money in the system overall increases, or at least remains the same as it is in status quo on our side of the house, because ordinary individuals who give for personal reasons continue to give that way, and the rich likely will remain the same as in status quo. On their side of the house, what they threaten to do is decrease the total amount of money that is in the system overall. When they do that, charitable causes are not capable of doing the good work that they do now. They fail the most vulnerable side with side opposition.
Judges, are we ready? Thumbs up, good.
Am I okay?
Yes, so thank you to the previous speaker for their fine remarks, and we now call on the proposition reply speaker to close the debate for us here.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, I think when a reply speaker stands up, and it is only at that point in the debate they manage to engage with the actual comparative that existed, they lose the debate. Two questions in this reply, but firstly, a clarification. Look, again and again, they accused us of squirreling the debate. But what we told you, based on the wording of the motion, was if we want to exclude minorities, we didn't want to exclude charities to do with women from this motion. We wanted to exclude actual minorities from this motion. That looks like it's excluding excluding charities of ethnic minorities and excluding charities of gay people. That was entirely fine to do that with this motion. But even at our worst panel, if you never bought what we told you, for some reason you read the motion differently, at our very worst, the harms are entirely symmetric, right? Because in the worst case scenarios, in the scenarios where gay people are in the worst societies, where people of ethnic minorities are in the societies that are abused the most, the charities that deal with those things aren't even going to be going into those places in the first place. So at our very, very, very worst, this question of donations is just a wash. What then was the actual comparative in this debate? The comparative they had to contend with was, is it better that a huge amount of people get to have a say in the way that that money is donated, or if a small amount of people get to have a say in the way that money is donated. Two questions then. Firstly, on our principle. We told you that the accumulation of wealth is arbitrary. Look, it was never actually contested in a meaningful way. We told you for multiple reasons, because of the birth lottery, because we're born into a position of power. At best, you're born into a middle-class family and start a tech company. At worst, you're born into a family that has, in many cases, used things like slavery to get oil, to start a food company. At our very best, that's the way that wealth is accumulated. So wealth accumulation was arbitrary, right? That is why we tax. That is why we do those things. You don't have an absolute right. We never said you've got no right to that capital. We said you don't have an absolute right to that capital, which meant at the point at which you donated some of that capital to the government to use that money as taxation, because you donated that capital didn't mean that it was only your interest that was involved in determining who this money went to, right? It was the interest of society in general. Because you have benefited from society in an arbitrary way, you have to give back to society in an arbitrary way. That was our principle. Ultimately, we were fine with raising taxes, but really the question was the money that goes to charities, how is that money spent? I think our principle stood. Their only responses really was that the average family wants to donate to a specific cause, they have a right to donate to a specific cause. But panel, at the point at which that charity is not effective, it is principally unjustifiable, and that family will principally be abhorred to donating to that cause, to donating to that charity. They would much rather a government determines which charity to do with cancer is most effective at actually solving cancer. They would much prefer on a principled level that family who has suffered from cancer to donate to that charity. Even if you don't buy that panel, weigh their principle against our principle. On our side, these people have a democratic right. It is democratically equal between them and wealthy philanthropists, the way that their opinions are heard. On their side then, that family might donate $100 while a philanthropist donates $1 billion. But even aside from this principle clash, which I think we won very clearly, we then have the second question, on the question of efficacy. Panel, you need to understand the relationship that money and efficacy had in this debate, right? Because a decrease in amount of money being donated to charity is a very static decrease. It only decreases once. But a decrease in efficacy is an exponential decrease in your ability to actually do anything. Because as you become a less and less effective charity, as you spend more and more money on advertising, it's clear that your charity is plagued with a culture of not being effective. That's what we told you. That's what they had to contend with. But we still had an equal number of donations on our side of the house. Because ultimately, the main thing that middle-class people and that wealthy people were concerned with were their own morality. We're feeling that they've given back to society in a meaningful way. That was ultimately the way that you should weigh this clash. Really then, we had a principal win. We had the exact same amount of money going into these charities. And because these charities were the charities that were most effective, the most effective charities got money. That meant, really for our case, on our side, new charities and neglected charities got to help people. It wasn't just the enfranchised charities. Never prouder to propose.
Okay. Thank you to that speaker for their fine remarks. We are now going to move into our deliberation room. And afterwards we'll have a result.
Thanks, Team Sri Lanka. Really good debate. Lots of fun.